Right, let's start AMP2 off with a discussion of the endocrine system. So what is the endocrine system? Well, it's going to be composed of a network of endocrine glands. And these glands make and secrete molecules that we call hormones directly into the interstitial space around them. So these glands don't have ducts, okay? They're just kind of secreting into the local environment around them. Those hormones then move from the interstitial space into the bloodstream and are transported throughout the body and exert their effects on different organs and different tissues via target cells. And all a target cell is a cell that has the receptors for a particular hormone. So the hormone binds the target cell, and it's the target cell that responds. For example, the hormone might bind a target cell and signal to that target cell to stop producing something or to stop secreting something or to act a certain way. And this is the way that the endocrine system exerts its effects throughout the body. So the body has two control systems, the endocrine system and the nervous system. Now, in AMP1, you learn about the nervous system and how it helps control the body. The endocrine system is similar in many ways to the nervous system. For example, like the nervous system, it releases chemical messengers called ligands. And these ligands bind to receptors on those target cells. Now, in the nervous system, we call these ligands neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, we call them hormones. Unlike the nervous system, these hormones can travel long distances through the blood. You may remember that neurotransmitters are really just released kind of at the synaptic cleft, and that's where one neuron interfaces with another neuron. Or neurotransmitters might be released onto the motor end plate of a muscle cell or directly onto a gland. Okay, but the neurotransmitters, generally speaking, don't get into the bloodstream and travel long distances. Hormones are able to do that. Hormones are also going to be able to target any cell in the body that has the receptors for that hormone. So it's not going to, the endocrine system doesn't exert localized effects, okay? These effects are diffuse. They're widespread. The endocrine system exhibits longer reaction times, so it takes a longer amount of time for the effects to begin, but the effects generally last longer than the effects of the nervous system. All right, general functions of hormones. They regulate development, growth, and metabolism. So they're in charge of embryonic cell division here. So the reason that you become a multicellular organism from a single cell is due to the influence of hormones. Hormones regulate our metabolism. They help regulate our blood composition and our blood volume. They help control digestive processes. You'll learn about some hormones that exert their effects over digestive organs in this course. And of course, hormones help control and regulate reproductive activities. So they're going to affect development and function of reproductive systems and the expression of sexual behaviors. All right, what is an endocrine gland made up of? Well, it's made up of epithelial tissue, specialized epithelial tissue that makes and secretes a product, a hormone. Some glands are fully standing endocrine organs with solely endocrine function. These will include things like the pituitary, the pineal gland, the thyroid, the adrenals, etc. Some endocrine cells can be found in clusters in organs that otherwise don't have an endocrine function. So, for example, the hypothalamus is essentially an area of specialized cells in the brain. The pancreas has specialized cells in it in clusters that produce insulin and glucagon. But the pancreas also has digestive functions outside of that. The kidneys have endocrine cells that produce the hormone erythropoietin. And of course, the gonads have endocrine cells as well. All right, so here's the this diagram kind of showing the difference between the major endocrine glands and then just the organs and tissues that also contain endocrine cells. So your major endocrine glands are going to be things like the parathyroid glands, the adrenal glands, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, and of course the thyroid. Organs and tissues containing endocrine cells, you can see, are varied. So you've got the brain, which contains the hypothalamus. The small intestine contains endocrine cells. Even adipose does as well. Okay, so widespread throughout the body, the endocrine system is. How are hormones released? How is that regulated? Well, by endocrine reflexes, okay? And so what happens is essentially the endocrine gland gets a stimulus and it responds to that stimulus. Now the stimulus can be either hormonal, humoral, or nervous. A hormonal stimulation is going to be a hormone that triggers the gland cell's release of hormone. A humoral stimulation occurs when a gland cell releases its hormone in response to something going on in the blood, like a change in the levels of a nutrient or an ion. For example, the pancreas releases insulin when blood glucose levels increase. And then finally, a nervous system stimulation, and this occurs when a gland cell releases its hormone when it's stimulated by a neuron. All right, so here are some examples. An example of hormonal stimulation might be when the anterior pituitary gland releases a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, and that hormone travels to the thyroid and acts on it to release thyroid hormone. An example of humoral stimulation, again, would be the pancreas, cells in the pancreas responding to blood glucose levels increasing and releasing insulin. And then finally, an example of nervous system stimulation. So the sympathetic nervous system, let's say it gets activated, the fight or flight response, right? And it sends a signal down to the adrenal gland, specifically the medulla of the adrenal gland. And that's going to trigger the adrenal gland to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. All right, question. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol hormone. This is an example of what type of stimulation? Hormonal, humoral, or nervous system? Well, it is itself a hormone, and it's triggering the adrenal cortex to release a hormone. So this is going to be an example of hormonal stimulation. Okay, categories of circulating hormones. So there's three basic categories we'll talk about: steroids, biogenic amines, and proteins. And they're either going to be lipid soluble or water soluble, okay? So we'll start off with the steroids. These guys are lipid soluble. They're actually synthesized from cholesterol. This is going to include your gonadal steroids, such as testosterone and estrogen. It's also going to include things like cortisol, things synthesized by the adrenal cortex. Calcitriol, remember, is the active form of vitamin D. It's sometimes classified as a steroid hormone. More accurately, it's called a sterol. Don't worry too much about that. Next, you have the biogenic amines, or you might hear them referred to as monoamines. These guys are amino acids that have been modified a little bit, and it's going to include the catecholamines, which are things like norepinephrine. It's going to include thyroid hormone, and it's going to include melatonin. All of these guys are water soluble except for thyroid hormone. And the reason for that is because thyroid hormone is nonpolar. You might recall nonpolar substances prefer one another. And so lipids are also nonpolar. So thyroid hormone is lipid soluble. And then you can have hormones that are proteins. And this is going to be most hormones. And protein hormones are water soluble. All they are chains of amino acids. Okay, and then in addition to having hormones that circulate throughout the body and go long distances, you can have hormones that act locally. Okay, these are going to be called local hormones, and they're just signaling molecules that don't circulate in the blood. They're going to bind to either the cells that release them. This is called autocrine stimulation. Okay, so a cell releases a hormone and it stimulates itself to do something. Or they can bind to neighboring cells, and that's called paracrine stimulation. Eicosanoids are a type of local hormone. What they're formed from is the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. Basically, an enzyme takes a piece of a phospholipid and converts it into an eicosanoid. And eicosanoids stimulate pain and inflammation. Prostaglandins are an example of eicosanoids. So drugs such as aspirin and other anti-inflammatory drugs, generally speaking, are going to block prostaglandin formation. And this is how they decrease pain. And this is just kind of showing how eicosanoids are formed. So phospholipase A2 is a type of enzyme in the cell, and it goes to the plasma membrane and removes arachidonic acid from a phospholipid. And then a whole bunch of enzymes convert that arachidonic acid to either a prostaglandin, a thromboxane, or a leukotriene. And remember, these guys are involved in inflammation and pain. Okay, so why do we care whether a hormone is lipid soluble or water soluble? Well, it's going to have ramifications for how the hormone is transported in the blood. Lipid soluble hormones are not going to be readily transported in blood. They don't dissolve readily in blood. And this makes sense if you think about oil and water. You cannot dissolve oil in water, okay? They just don't mix. So lipid-soluble hormones are going to require a carrier protein in order to move through the blood. Okay, and those carrier proteins are water-soluble. And what they do is they essentially protect those hormones from destruction in the bloodstream. So you can kind of think of the carrier proteins and the hormone being like a running back holding a football, and how he protects the football while he's running. Well, that's kind of how these carrier proteins protect the hormones while they're traveling through the bloodstream. Now, this binding between the hormone and the carrier is not permanent. Okay, it's temporary. There's attachment, detachment, reattachment, kind of all happening. Most of the time, about 90% of the hormone is bound. So most of the time, hormone is bound. About 10% of the time, this hormone is going to be free, unbound, able to exit the blood. And that's important because we need hormones to be able to exit the blood to get to their target cells and bind to those receptors. Now, on the other hand, most water-soluble hormones are able to travel freely through the blood, right, because they are water-soluble. A few do use carrier proteins to help prolong their biological half-life. All right, a hormone's blood concentration is going to depend on two things. Number one, how fast it's being made, and number two, how fast it's being eliminated. This should make sense to you. Hormone release and its concentration in the blood are positively correlated. All that means is that the more hormone you release, the higher its concentration is going to be in the blood. Hormone elimination can occur in multiple ways. The liver can break down hormones through enzymes, enzymatic degradation. The kidneys can remove hormones through excretion into the urine, or target cells themselves can uptake the hormone. The faster the elimination rate, the lower the blood concentration. Okay, and that kind of brings up this concept of biological half-life. And this is the time that it takes to reduce a hormone's concentration to half of its original level. Biological half-life is going to depend on how efficiently the hormone is eliminated. Hormones that have shorter half-lives are going to be secreted more frequently than hormones with longer half-lives in order to maintain the normal blood concentration of the hormone. In general, water-soluble hormones are going to have a really short half-life, okay? Half-life of a few minutes for many small peptide hormones. Contrast this with steroid hormones, which can have a half-life of up to 12 days with testosterone, for example. So steroid hormones are going to have a much longer half-life than water-soluble hormones. All right, lipid-soluble hormones and water-soluble hormones are also going to exert their effects on their target cells through different mechanisms. When lipid-soluble hormones reach their target cells, they can diffuse directly across the target cell's membrane. And remember, this is because these hormones are nonpolar, and so nonpolar substances are lipophilic, that is, they like lipids, and that cell membrane is made out of lipids. The receptors for lipid-soluble hormones are going to be found either inside the cell or in the nucleus. Once the hormone enters the cell, it's going to bind to its receptor either in the cytosol or in the nucleus and form this complex called the hormone receptor complex. And that complex goes on to bind to a hormone response element that's found in DNA. And this is going to result in a gene being turned on. Okay, so this is called induction, and this is when a gene basically starts being read, transcribed into an mRNA, and then that mRNA goes on to become a protein. Now, because we're turning on a gene, and then we're making a transcript out of that gene, and then we're taking that transcript and we're translating it into a protein, this process takes time. So this is why lipid-soluble hormones take longer to take effect. But remember, their effects are going to last longer compared to water-soluble hormones. Alright, so this figure just kind of goes over what we just talked about. So here's the blood vessel. Here is a target cell. Here is a carrier protein and a lipid-soluble hormone that's bound to that carrier protein, and you can see it travels through the blood. It becomes an unbound hormone, and these unbound hormones are able to diffuse, travel across the blood vessel and diffuse into the target cell. Now, when they get into the target cell, they're going to bind to the hormone receptor and form the hormone receptor complex. And then remember, this complex goes on to interact with DNA and bind to the hormone response element of DNA. That tells the cell to start reading that gene. So that gene gets made into an mRNA transcript. That mRNA transcript is then exported out of the nucleus, right, into either the cytosol or the rough endoplasmic reticulum, where it's going to be made into proteins. And this process is called translation. All right, so that's how lipid-soluble hormones work. How do water-soluble hormones work? Well, remember, they're water-soluble, so they cannot diffuse across that lipid plasma membrane. So they're going to have to rely on binding to receptors that are on the cell's surface. This is going to initiate something called a signal transduction pathway. what happens here is the hormone acts as a first messenger. That is, it's going to initiate all of these events by binding to that receptor on the cell's surface. When the hormone binds to that receptor, it's going to activate a special protein inside of the cell called a G protein. And it's going to basically make that G protein want to bind GTP instead of GDP. Binding of that GTP is going to cause activation of an enzyme that's in the plasma membrane. Examples may be something like adenylate cyclase or phospholipase C. And then these activated enzymes go on to catalyze the formation of a second messenger. And then that second messenger goes on and modifies cellular activity. And I'll show you what I mean right now. Okay, so first, let's talk about the G protein and how it gets activated. Okay, so up here, we have kind of just things normal at rest. You've got the cytoplasmic membrane, the cell surface receptor here, the water-soluble hormone out here outside of the cell, and then inside of the cell you have this inactive G protein that's bound to GDP. Now, what happens when a hormone binds to that cell surface receptor? It's going to activate that receptor, okay? This receptor is a protein, and the binding of that hormone is going to make that protein change its shape a little bit. And when it does that, it's going to be able to interact with a G protein. So the G protein binds to this activated receptor, and that's going to change the shape of the G protein. And so the G protein is going to lose its GDP and be able to bind GTP. When the G protein binds GTP, it's going to be released from that receptor, and it can go on to interact with an enzyme in the plasma membrane. Now, that enzyme in the plasma membrane could be something like adenylate cyclase, or it could be something like phospholipase C. So let's talk about adenylate cyclase first. Here comes that activated G protein from before, and it comes along and it interacts with adenylate cyclase. This is an enzyme. Now, when it does that, it's going to change the shape of adenylate cyclase, and that allows the enzyme to convert ATP molecules to cyclic AMP molecules. Cyclic AMP, or CAMP, is the second messenger, and what it goes on to do is it goes on to activate another enzyme called protein kinase A. And what protein kinase A does is it adds phosphate groups to a bunch of different molecules. And this has wide-ranging effects for the cell. That's all you need to know. That's the extent that you need to know. Okay, what happens when that activated G protein moving along the plasma membrane, instead of interacting with adenylate cyclase, interacts with phospholipase C? Well, when it binds to phospholipase C, it's going to activate that enzyme, and phospholipase C is going to be able to do its job, and its job is to split this molecule called PIP2 into two other molecules, IP3 and DAG, or diacylglyceride and inositol triphosphate. Diacylglycerol is going to go on to activate another enzyme called protein kinase C, and this guy goes on to phosphorylate a bunch of different molecules. Inositol triphosphate goes down here and triggers release of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum. Calcium is a third messenger, okay, and goes on to interact with a bunch of different enzymes and activate them. Calcium can also interact or alter the permeability of different ion channels throughout the cell. So you can see how one single hormone molecule binding back here can trigger wide-ranging effects throughout the cell. Okay, so what is the end result of all of this? Well, ultimately, remember, that hormone binding and triggering a signal transduction pathway is going to result in some sort of response from the target cell. So a product is going to be secreted, channels are going to be opened, proteins are going to be made, proteins are going to stop being made, okay? Things like this. Okay, so this is how water-soluble hormones interact on a cellular level and are able to get a response from their target cells. And this is just a list with some of the actions of water-soluble hormones. So activation or inhibition of different enzymes and their pathways, growth through cellular division, release of cellular secretions, opening and closing different ion channels is going to result in changes in membrane permeability. Even some hormones have action on smooth muscle and can initiate muscle contraction or relaxation. Okay, so water-soluble hormones trigger signal transduction pathways, and those signal transduction pathways use intracellular enzyme cascades. And I'll show you what this is in just a second. But what happens with an intracellular enzyme cascade is that the signal is going to be amplified at each enzymatic step. And ultimately, what this means in a practical sense is that just a few hormone molecules can change many molecules within the cell and have a pretty drastic effect on the cell. How are signaling pathways controlled? Well, the cell is going to possess mechanisms to quickly inactivate the intermediates of these enzyme cascades, okay? And so, for example, the cell may be able to break down second messengers very quickly, and so they stop the rest of the pathway from being able to move forward. Okay, here is an example of an intracellular enzymatic cascade. So we start at the top up here with a molecule of epinephrine. You can see this molecule of epinephrine is ultimately going to activate an adenylate cyclase. Now, each adenylate cyclase can result in multiple molecules of CAMP being made. CAMP goes on to activate protein kinase A, and each protein kinase A can go on to activate multiple enzymes, and each one of those enzymes can go on and create multiple products. Okay, so you can see how there's amplification throughout this enzymatic cascade. Okay, what's going to influence a cell's response to a hormone? Well, two things. Its number of receptors for the hormone, and whether it's simultaneously responding to other hormones. Okay, so receptor number fluctuates, okay, and there's this thing called upregulation and downregulation. Upregulation is when the cell increases its number of receptors, and this is going to increase its sensitivity to hormone. You see this in a couple of settings. Sometimes when the blood levels of the hormone are very low, a cell senses that and will upregulate its receptors so that it has a better chance of catching the few hormone molecules that are circulating, okay? And sometimes upregulation is going to occur with changes in development, the cell cycle, or cell activity. Now, downregulation is going to be just the opposite. This is a decrease in the number of receptors. And this decreases the cell's sensitivity to the hormone. You may see this when blood levels of the hormone are high, so the cell decreases its number of receptors so that it interacts with fewer hormone molecules, and the hormone has less of an effect on the cell. However, it can also occur due to changes in development, cell cycle, and cell activity. This is just showing upregulation versus downregulation. So upregulation, the cell's going to have a lot more receptors on it than it did before, and this is to catch the hormone that's passing by. Remember, this typically occurs when hormone levels are low. Downregulation is the opposite, so the cell downregulates or decreases its number of receptors because there's just hormone all over the place. This happens when hormone levels tend to be high. Now, a hormone's effects on a cell can be influenced by the cell's interaction with other hormones. Different hormones can simultaneously bind to a cell, and their effects can interact. There's synergistic interactions, permissive interactions, and antagonistic interactions. In synergistic interaction, one hormone is reinforcing the activity of another hormone. For example, estrogen and progesterone. They have synergistic effects. So when they work together, the effects are greater than either one of them working by themselves. There's permissive interactions. This occurs when one hormone requires the activity of another hormone. For example, oxytocin. It stimulates milk ejection, but first you need prolactin to stimulate milk production. And then hormones can have antagonistic interactions. This is when one hormone opposes the activity of another hormone. And a good example here is glucagon, which increases blood sugar or blood glucose, and insulin, which lowers blood glucose. So if a target cell is being acted on by both glucagon and insulin, you can see how the effects on it would be minimal because these guys have opposing effects. And this figure is just showing the different hormone interactions. Down here you have synergistic. Remember, this is when hormones work together to produce a greater effect. You have permissive interactions. This is when the first hormone allows the action of a second hormone. And then you have antagonistic interactions. This is when the hormones oppose one another. Okay, let's shift our discussion now over to endocrine organs and the hormones that they make. So let's start with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland goes on to control several other endocrine organs. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. It's going to be inferior, just inferior to the hypothalamus. It's cradled in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. It's about the size of a pea. It is physically connected to the hypothalamus by the infundibulum. And the pituitary gland is partitioned into two parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary arise from different areas in the developing embryo. And so that's one of the things that makes them different. We'll talk about the other differences between the anterior and posterior pituitary. Okay, the posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. This guy is smaller than the anterior pituitary, and it's the neural part of the pituitary gland. So what's going on with the posterior pituitary is the hypothalamus has neurons that travel through that infundibulum and release hormones directly in the posterior pituitary. The cell bodies of those neurons are going to be in the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. The axons of these hypothalamic neurons are located in the infundibulum, specifically the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And then the synaptic knobs of those neurons are in the posterior pituitary. All right, here's a diagram showing what we just talked about. So this region outlined by purple here is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus has neurons that travel through the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary. Okay, so this is the posterior portion here. This would be the anterior pituitary here. Okay, so that's how the hypothalamus and the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary gland, communicate. How does the anterior pituitary gland communicate with the hypothalamus? Well, through a portal system, okay, the hypophyseal portal system. And all this is a capillary bed connected to another capillary bed via a small vein. There's the primary plexus. This is the capillary network that's associated with the hypothalamus. There's a secondary plexus. That's the capillary network associated with the anterior pituitary. And then they're going to be connected by hypophyseal portal veins. So here's an example here. You have the primary plexus. This is the capillary bed associated with the hypothalamus. And then we have the hypophyseal portal veins. And then those connect to the secondary plexus, which is associated with the anterior pituitary. So you can see how hormones released from the hypothalamus can travel through this bloodstream, through the bloodstream, and interact with and act on the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, let's talk a second about the hormones of the posterior pituitary. So remember, the posterior pituitary is not a gland like the anterior pituitary is. It's really just an area where these specialized neurons in the hypothalamus, they're called neurosecretory cells, store and release their products. Okay, so the posterior pituitary is going to mainly be storage for antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Remember, these hormones are made by the hypothalamus. They travel through the infundibulum and they're released into the posterior pituitary gland. Antidiuretic hormone is also called vasopressin. It's made in that supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then it's going to travel down those axons through the infundibulum and be released from synaptic knobs in the posterior pituitary. The functions of antidiuretic hormone: it decreases urine production, it stimulates thirst, and it constricts blood vessels. So this is a hormone that is released when you are dehydrated. Okay, so it's going to decrease urine production, so you're holding on to more fluid. It's going to stimulate thirst in you, so you take in more fluid. And it's going to constrict your blood vessels, which you will learn helps maintain your blood pressure. Oxytocin is made in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, travels down that infundibulum, and is released into the posterior pituitary, and its functions are uterine contraction, milk ejection, and it's sometimes called the love hormone because it is involved in emotional bonding. Alright, so here you can see the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, and the posterior pituitary. You can see those neurons or neurosecretory cells. The ones here in the paraventricular nucleus are producing oxytocin. The ones here in the supraoptic nucleus are producing antidiuretic hormone. And the posterior pituitary just stores and releases these hormones. Remember, they're not actually made in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so how do the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary work together to release hormones? Well, the hypothalamus is going to release its hormones, and those hormones act on the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. The hypothalamus secretes regulatory hormones, and remember, these are going to travel via that portal system, those two capillary networks connected by a vein, to the pituitary, to the anterior pituitary. And then the anterior pituitary is going to secrete its hormones into the secondary plexus, that second capillary network. And from there, those hormones get transported into the general circulation. Okay, this is a good little list here of the different hormones. The ones that are produced by the hypothalamus, and then the ones that are produced by the anterior pituitary. So when you're studying, I would go take a look at this and make sure that you are familiar with which hormones are being released from which structure. Okay, the hypothalamus hormones. You can basically break them down into two groups. There's releasing hormones. These guys are going to increase the secretion of a hormone from the anterior pituitary. And then there's inhibiting hormones. This is going to decrease the secretion of a hormone by the anterior pituitary. Okay, examples here. We have thyrotropin releasing hormone. This hormone acts on the anterior pituitary and tells it to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. You have prolactin releasing hormone. Again, this is going to act on the anterior pituitary and tell it to release prolactin. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, released from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary and tells the anterior pituitary to release gonadotropins such as follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone. This goes to the anterior pituitary and tells the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is a hormone that's released from the adrenal glands. And then, of course, growth hormone releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. And then we have a couple of inhibiting hormones down here. You have prolactin inhibiting hormone. Again, is going to act on the anterior pituitary, but this time tell it to stop secreting prolactin. And growth inhibiting hormone, again acting on the anterior pituitary, telling it to stop releasing growth hormone. All right, what do the hormones of the anterior pituitary do? Well, I already mentioned a lot of these. There's thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This is going to cause release of thyroid hormone. So the pituitary gland is going to release TSH in response to TRH from the hypothalamus. That TSH is going to travel from the pituitary gland to the thyroid, and it's going to act on the thyroid and cause that thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. There's prolactin. This, remember, is going to cause milk production. It's also going to cause mammary gland growth. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. This causes the release of corticosteroids by the adrenal cortex. The anterior pituitary produces gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. And in women, this is going to regulate ovarian development and the secretion of estrogen and progesterone. And in men, this is going to help regulate sperm development and secretion of testosterone. And then you have growth hormone. And what growth hormone does is it's secreted from the anterior pituitary, and it goes to the liver, and it's going to cause the liver to secrete IGF-1 and IGF-2. This is insulin-like growth factors 1 and 2. And growth hormone and those IGFs are going to function synergistically on multiple different cells throughout the body to stimulate cell growth and division. Okay, so here we have a good figure showing the different hormones of the anterior pituitary. Again, a really great reference for when you're studying. So prolactin is going to be released from the anterior pituitary, and it's going to act on mammary glands. And remember, it influences the growth of those mammary glands, and it stimulates milk production. FSH and LH are going to go to act on either the ovaries or the testes. ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to act on the thyroid. And then growth hormone stimulates the release of IGFs from the liver. And then those IGFs and growth hormone act synergistically together on body tissues, especially cartilage, bone, muscle, and adipose. Okay, remember, regulation of the anterior pituitary is by the hypothalamus. Those hormones that the hypothalamus secrete control or regulate the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary. The hormones released from the anterior pituitary, except for prolactin, are tropic hormones. That is, they stimulate other endocrine glands to release their hormones. All right, let's go a little more in depth into growth hormone. So we've already talked about this one a bit. Remember that the hypothalamus is going to release growth hormone releasing hormone, and that's going to act on the anterior pituitary, which then releases growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to act on the liver to release insulin-like growth factors, and growth hormone and those insulin-like growth factors both together synergistically are going to stimulate target cells. And this stimulates growth and the release of nutrients into the blood. Growth hormone and those insulin-like growth factors are going to be regulated by negative feedback. Okay, so what influences the release of growth hormone releasing hormone? A person's age. So GHRH and growth hormone are both going to be highest in children and adolescents and decrease with age. The time of day matters. Release tends to occur more heavily at night. Nutrient levels influence growth hormone. Fasting or a decrease in nutrient levels stimulates growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone release. However, prolonged fasting can lead to peripheral growth hormone resistance. Stress and exercise tend to increase the release of growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone. However, severe or chronic stress can decrease growth hormone. And then, of course, the circulating levels of growth hormone and IGF are going to influence whether growth hormone releasing hormone is released. All right, so we said the effect of growth hormone is to stimulate release of those IGFs or insulin-like growth factors from the liver. And then the growth hormone and the IGFs are going to go on to act on potentially every cell in the body. All cells have receptors for either growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor, or both. Now, when growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor act on a cell, they're going to stimulate increased protein synthesis, cell division, and cell differentiation. And this should make sense because growth hormone promotes growth and development. So you're going to see more proteins being made, cells dividing more, and cells differentiating into different cell types. These guys are also going to stimulate release of nutrients from storage. So you're going to see glycogenolysis. This is the breakdown, right, or lysis of glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose. You're going to see gluconeogenesis, right? So genesis means beginning, neo means new, and gluco means glucose. So glucose new beginning means you're creating new glucose molecules. You'll see glycogenesis. This is the synthesis of glycogen inhibited. Okay, so you're going to be breaking down glycogen. You're not going to be building it up. You're going to see lipolysis, or the breakdown of triglycerides, lipids, stimulated, and lipogenesis, or the formation of triglycerides, inhibited. Okay, so here's an overview of the regulation and action of growth hormone. Remember, we're going to start with a stimulus, something that's going to influence the release of growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And then that growth hormone releasing hormone is going to go down and act on the anterior pituitary to cause the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone goes to the liver and stimulates the liver cells to release insulin-like growth factors into the bloodstream. And then growth hormone and the IGFs travel throughout the body to act on different body cells. So all cells are going to see increased growth, increased amino acid uptake, and therefore increased protein synthesis, higher cell division rates, cell differentiation, and you can see the effects on the liver and on adipose tissue here as well. Now, the circulating levels of growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor are going to inhibit the release of growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So this is a negative feedback mechanism, and this is kind of how the body keeps everything in check. All right, so let's take a clinical view here and look at pituitary dwarfism, also called growth hormone deficiency. What this is a condition caused by hyposecretion or low secretion of growth hormone during childhood. It can happen for several different reasons. You can have congenital underdevelopment of the hypothalamus or the anterior pituitary, or you can have damage to either one of those structures, either through tumors, infection, trauma, even radiation. Genetic mutations can cause a hyposecretion of growth hormone, and many times it's idiopathic, which means that we just don't know what the cause is. So what's going to happen ultimately? Well, low growth hormone means that you're going to have fewer effects on cartilage and bone growth. So what happens is children grow proportionally, but they reach a much shorter adult height than average. Signs are primarily short stature and normal body proportions. This is in contrast to other conditions like achondroplasia, which has to do with improper endochondral ossification. So achondroplasia disproportionately affects the long bones of the body, and that's why growth is typically disproportionate. Growth hormone here is acting on all of the cartilage and bone. It's not selectively only acting on the long bones. So you have a proportional growth. Okay, the opposite of pituitary dwarfism is pituitary gigantism. And this is excessive growth hormone production in children and adolescents. And here you're going to see the opposite of what you saw in growth hormone deficiency. You're going to have an increase in length of the long bones, and this is going to lead to extreme height. You're going to have increased release of glucose, enlargement of internal organs, and unfortunately this results from the loss of feedback control of growth hormone before the epiphyseal plates close. So that's why they're able to grow to such extreme heights. Contrast this with acromegaly. This is excessive growth hormone production in an adult, so after the epiphyseal plates have closed. And with acromegaly, you get enlargement of the bones of the face, the hands, and the feet. Again, you're going to get increased release of glucose, internal organs increasing in size, and again, this is results from a loss of feedback control of growth hormone. All right, here are some pictures of the tallest woman in the world next to the shortest woman in the world. And the differences that you see in these two individuals are due to the action of growth hormone on their bodies. So in this woman's case, she did not make enough growth hormone, so she did not grow as tall as the average adult. This woman makes more growth hormone than usual, and so she grew much taller than the average adult. All right, moving on, let's talk about the thyroid gland. This guy is inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, and it's anterior to the trachea. has a left lobe and a right lobe connected in the middle by an isthmus. It's highly vascularized, and it's composed of these microscopic follicles. Okay, and these follicles are composed of follicular cells surrounding a central lumen. The follicular cells themselves are cuboidal epithelial cells, and they synthesize thyroglobulin, and they produce and release thyroid hormone. Now, that central lumen houses colloid, which is a viscous protein-rich fluid. Okay, then you have the parafollicular cells. These are the cells between the follicles, and they make calcitonin, which is a hormone that decreases blood calcium levels. All right, so this is what the thyroid gland looks like. You can see it has a left lobe, a right lobe, and then in the center here, connecting both of them, an isthmus. You can see it's inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx, and it lies anterior to the trachea. Now, some people have an extra lobe called the pyramidal lobe, and that would be right about here, and you'll see that in your lab. Okay, this is what the thyroid gland is composed of, these microscopic follicles. So you can see they're going to be composed of follicular cells surrounding a central lumen, which contains colloid. And then kind of here in the middle, between the follicles, you're going to see parafollicular cells. And remember, they produce calcitonin. Okay, how is thyroid hormone made? Well, let's take a look at this diagram here. This is a follicular cell. This is the bloodstream outside of the follicle. And this would be the inside of the follicle, the colloid, okay? Now, the follicular cell is producing something called thyroglobulin. And what thyroglobulin is a really long protein molecule that has a bunch of the amino acid tyrosine. And so it's got a bunch of these tyrosines hanging off of it. Now, what the follicular cell does is it produces this thyroglobulin and releases it through exocytosis into the colloid, into the lumen of the follicle. At the same time, iodide ions are being brought in from the bloodstream. Okay, so this you get from your diet, from ingesting things with iodine in it. And so you bring in the iodide ions, they get oxidized in the lumen of the follicle, and then, so now they're iodine, they get placed on to those tyrosines of the thyroglobulin. So you can either have one or two iodine molecules added on to these tyrosines. Next, those tyrosines in the thyroglobulin can bind to one another. Okay, and when they do, pre-T3 and pre-T4 are formed. It's T3 if there are 3 total iodine added to the molecule. It's pre-T4 if there are 4 total iodine. Okay? Then this structure is brought back into the follicular cell. And then it gets fused with a lysosome, which breaks down that thyroglobulin and leaves just the now T4 and T3. Okay, so before thyroglobulin was broken down, it's pre-T3 and pre-T4. After thyroglobulin is broken down, it's T3 and T4. And it's these two hormones that are released from the follicular cell into the bloodstream and go to act on the body. All right, how is thyroid hormone release regulated? Well, you're going to start with the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to be sampling the bloodstream for thyroid hormone. And let's say there's a decrease in the concentration of thyroid hormone. Well, that's going to signal the hypothalamus to release thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which we said goes on to the anterior pituitary and acts there. And the anterior pituitary then releases TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone. Remember, TSH goes into the bloodstream, travels to the thyroid, and triggers the thyroid to release thyroid hormone. Now, there's two forms of thyroid hormone. There's T3, or triiodothyronine, and then there's T4, or thyroxine. Now, you may recall that thyroid hormone, although it's not a steroid hormone, it is lipid soluble. So it's going to need to be transported by protein carriers. Then it's going to stimulate target cells, and this is going to result in an increased metabolic rate and release of nutrients into the blood. Now, thyrotropin-releasing hormone and thyroid-stimulating hormone are both regulated by negative feedback. The stimuli that regulate release of TRH, so we said the main one is going to be change in blood levels of thyroid hormone. So as thyroid hormone increases in response to the release of TRH and TSH, that increase is going to be detected by the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to decrease its release of TRH, which is then going to result in a decrease of TSH, and ultimately a decrease in thyroid hormone. What determines the set point for a person's thyroid hormone level? It's going to be determined by a lot of different things. Genetics, changes in development, such as puberty or aging, and then environmental factors like vitamin D deficiency. All right, so here you have it laid out for you in a figure. So the hypothalamus is going to detect a stimulus, let's say low blood levels of thyroid hormone, and that's going to cause it to release TRH, which then travels from that primary plexus down those portal veins to that secondary plexus, that capillary bed that surrounds the anterior pituitary. And there, TRH is going to act on the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH is going to enter the systemic circulation and make its way to the thyroid gland, where it's going to act on the thyroid gland and stimulate it to release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone gets into the bloodstream, and then there it's going to travel to various cells throughout the body and exert its effects. Overall, what you're going to see is an increased metabolic rate and nutrients released into the blood, so breakdown of those storage forms of nutrients. Now remember, thyroid hormone is going to circulate through the bloodstream, including up here by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is going to detect that the levels of thyroid hormone have increased, and that's going to cause the hypothalamus to decrease TRH release, and that results in a decrease in TSH and ultimately a decrease in thyroid hormone. And that's negative feedback. All right, a little more on the effects of thyroid hormone. Let's talk a second just about T3 versus T4. The thyroid gland is going to produce more T4, but T3 is much, much more active on the cells than T4 is. So you'll find that most target cells convert T4 to T3. And then that T3 acts on the target cell. Now, what does thyroid hormone do? Well, we already said it increases the metabolic rate. It's going to increase protein synthesis as well. And it's going to stimulate the synthesis of those sodium-potassium pumps in neurons. This ultimately is going to result in heat and raise the temperature of the person. Thyroid hormone is also going to stimulate increased amino acid and glucose uptake, as well as increase the number of enzymes within mitochondria. Remember those enzymes involved in cellular respiration. And what was the overall goal of cellular respiration? It was to make ATP. So an increase in the number of these enzymes means that your cells can make more ATP. They're going to need more ATP because the metabolic rate is increased. Okay, and because you are increasing the amount of ATP you can make, you need to increase the amount of fuel that you can use in order to make that ATP. So the thyroid hormone is going to act on hepatocytes to increase blood glucose. And how that works is it causes an increase in breakdown of glycogen. Remember, that's the storage form of glucose. And it causes an increase in gluconeogenesis. And remember, that's forming glucose from other precursor molecules. Adipose cells, in response to thyroid hormone, are going to be stimulated to increase blood glycerol and fatty acids. This is because thyroid hormone causes an increase in lipolysis and a decrease in lipogenesis. And ultimately, this saves glucose for the brain. Remember, the brain prefers glucose. Thyroid hormone is going to increase your respiration rate, and this is to meet that additional oxygen demand of that increased cellular respiration. Thyroid hormone is also going to increase heart rate and the force of contraction of the heart. This is going to increase blood flow to deliver more nutrients and more oxygen to the tissues. Thyroid hormone does this through causing the heart to upregulate receptors for epinephrine and norepinephrine. And remember, upregulation is going to make that cell more sensitive to those molecules. Okay, let's talk a minute about disorders of the thyroid. So you can have hyperthyroidism. This results from too much thyroid hormone. And patients see an increased metabolic rate, so they're going to, have weight loss. They might feel very hyperactive. They might have heat intolerance because remember, thyroid hormone is ultimately going to raise the body temperature through raising the metabolic rate. Causes include excessive thyroid hormone ingestion, excessive stimulation by the pituitary, or there can be something wrong with the thyroid itself and it doesn't respond to lower TSH levels the way that it should. Treatment is two-pronged. First, you're going to remove the diseased thyroid. Secondly, you're going to give thyroid hormone supplements for the remainder of that patient's life because they now are lacking a thyroid. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disorder, and it is an example of hyperthyroidism. So in Graves' disease, these patients' bodies make antibodies that look a lot like thyroid-stimulating hormone. And these antibodies act on the thyroid gland and stimulate it to produce thyroid hormone. This is going to lead to high levels of that thyroid hormone in the blood and all of the effects that you see with it. However, because you would think because there's high thyroid hormone levels that TSH should ultimately be suppressed. But remember, these antibodies are kind of doing their own thing, and they mimic TSH, and they are going to continue to stimulate the thyroid gland regardless of how much thyroid hormone is circulating in the blood. Okay, hypothyroidism is just the opposite. This is going to result from decreased production of thyroid hormone. So patients are going to have a lower metabolic rate. They're going to feel lethargic. They're going to be intolerant to cold, and they'll experience weight gain. Causes here include decreased iodine intake. Okay, so you don't have enough iodine. You can't add the iodine to those tyrosine molecules and make thyroid hormone. Loss of pituitary stimulation for some reason. This can also be post-surgical or immune system destruction of the thyroid. We'll talk about that in a second. How do you treat it? With thyroid hormone replacement. All right, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is an autoimmune disorder that causes destruction of the thyroid gland. And in this disease, the immune system attacks the thyroid cells, destroying them. So overall, you have a decreased production of T3 and T4. So you're going to have those symptoms: the low metabolic rate, the weight gain, the fatigue, the cold intolerance. And remember, there's a loss of feedback control here. Low thyroid hormone normally would trigger TSH to rise, but the damaged thyroid, something's wrong with it, so it can't respond the way that it should. All right, goiter. What is a goiter? Well, it's just an enlarged thyroid gland. And why it happens is two general reasons. First, you can have it happen due to low thyroid hormone. And you classically see this due to iodine deficiency. So remember, you need to take in iodine from your diet in order to add it to those tyrosine molecules in order to make thyroid hormone. So you're not able to do that. The thyroid hormone levels are going to drop. The hypothalamus is going to sense that and release TRH, which is going to act on the pituitary gland, which then increases TSH release. That TSH goes to stimulate the thyroid, the cells of the thyroid to grow and to divide and to enlarge, all in an effort to make more hormone. However, the issue here is not really with the thyroid gland, it's with the supplies to the thyroid. So what you get is you get a big enlarged thyroid that still can't make the hormone. Second, you can get enlargement of the thyroid gland due to an overstimulated thyroid. For example, here would be Graves' disease. So remember, in Graves' disease, the body produces autoantibodies. These are antibodies that act against the body's own tissues. And in this case, the tissue it's acting against is the thyroid gland. And so these autoantibodies trigger the thyroid, the cells in the thyroid to grow, to divide, and to make too much hormone. Now, in this situation, the thyroid is not diseased itself. It's really the autoantibodies that are causing the problem. So when these autoantibodies trigger the thyroid to grow, there is going to be more production of hormone because the thyroid gland is able to make the hormone here. The gland enlarges, and the result is going to be the goiter and way too much hormone being made. And these are just some examples of goiters. This one is a little more subtle. This is typically what you would see in a clinical setting, at least in the United States. This over here is a markedly enlarged thyroid gland. And typically you see this in patients who are malnourished and extremely iodine deficient. Little note about calcitonin. So remember, calcitonin is going to be synthesized by and released from those parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. The stimulus here is going to be high blood calcium or stress from exercise, but classically and on the test you will see high blood calcium. What calcitonin does is it acts to decrease blood calcium levels. And it does this by inhibiting osteoclasts and stimulating the kidneys to increase excretion of calcium in the urine. So the kidneys start to release more calcium. So these two actions decrease blood calcium levels. You're going to see this has the most significant effect in the bones of growing children, where there's the greatest turnover of bone. All right, the adrenal glands. These guys are located on the superior surface of each kidney. They are retroperitoneal. That is, they are behind the peritoneum. They're going to be embedded in fat and fascia. And there's two regions you need to know about. There's the adrenal medulla. This is the inside, the core of the adrenal gland. And it contains these cells called chromaffin cells, which are modified post-ganglionic sympathetic neurons. Okay, so the controlling input to the adrenal medulla is going to be the sympathetic nervous system. The medulla is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine upon that sympathetic system stimulation. Then you have the adrenal cortex. And the cortex is going to synthesize a bunch of different corticosteroids. There's three regions that are going to produce different steroid hormones depending on the region. There's the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. And this is moving from outermost layer, so the glomerulosa is the outermost layer of the adrenal cortex, to the innermost layer, the zona reticularis. And the way to remember this is through the band Grand Funk Railroad. G for zona glomerulosa, F for zona fasciculata, and R for zona reticularis. Alright, here's a dissection showing the right kidney, and then on top of the right kidney here, the superior pole of the kidney, is the adrenal gland. Alright, this is showing the adrenal gland in cut here. So you can see the outermost part, the cortex, and then the inner core of the gland here, the medulla. Now, if you zoomed in on an area and looked at it under a microscope, you would see the cortex here composed of three distinct zones. Remember, the zona glomerulosa is the outermost, the zona fasciculata is the middle layer, and then the zona reticularis is the innermost zone. And then you'll see the adrenal medulla, which, remember, is composed of chromaffin cells. And don't forget, you can remember this with Grand Funk Railroad. Okay, so what hormones do each of those zones make? Well, in the zona glomerulosa, you're going to see mineralocorticoids. And what these guys do is they regulate electrolyte levels. The big one here to know about is aldosterone. And what aldosterone does is it signals the kidneys to retain sodium and to secrete potassium. All right, in the middle zone, the zona fasciculata, you're going to have glucocorticoids. And these are hormones that regulate blood sugar. For example, cortisol, which increases blood sugar. And then finally, in the zona reticularis, you're going to have the gonadocorticoids, and these are sex hormones. For example, the adrenal androgens. All right, so the way I was taught this, and the way to remember, first you need to remember mineralocorticoids include aldosterone, which involves sodium retention. So remember, salt, sugar, sex. It gets sweeter the further in you go. That's how you remember mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids, and which zone each one belongs to. All right, let's talk a little bit about the regulation of cortisol release. So, again, it's going to be the hypothalamus monitoring things, and it's going to release corticotropin-releasing hormone. And CRH goes on to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACT. ACTH. ACTH goes through the bloodstream and travels and makes its way to the adrenal glands, to the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex, to release those glucocorticoids, primarily cortisol. Cortisol then travels through the blood, and remember, this is going to be a steroid hormone, so it's going to be attached to a carrier protein, and it's going to stimulate target cells. The overall result is going to be an increase of nutrients in the blood. And CRH and ACTH, like we've seen so far, are both going to be regulated by negative feedback. All right, what factors regulate the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone? Well, first of all, you're going to have negative feedback. So if you have an increase in cortisol levels, that's going to signal the hypothalamus to decrease CRH. The time of day also matters. CRH, ACTH, and cortisol are going to increase at night and peak in the early morning. And stress is also a factor. All three are going to be released with increased stress. In fact, cortisol is nicknamed the stress hormone. All right, what are the effects of cortisol? Overall, you're going to see an increase in blood nutrient levels. The liver cells are going to increase glycogenolysis, right? Breakdown of glycogen, and gluconeogenesis. Adipose cells are going to increase the breakdown of lipids. The body cells are going to begin breaking down proteins to amino acids. Liver cells are going to use those amino acids for gluconeogenesis. And then most cells are going to decrease their glucose uptake, leaving it for the brain. We also use corticosteroids therapeutically. Corticosteroid is one that's used as a treatment for inflammation. And what it does is it inhibits inflammation, but it also suppresses the immune system at the same time. So at high doses and for long durations, it can start to have side effects. You'll see an increased risk of infection and cancer because you're suppressing the immune system with corticosteroids. You'll see increased retention of sodium and water, and you're going to inhibit the tissue repair processes of the body by using this at high doses or for long duration. All right, let's talk a minute about disorders in the adrenal cortex hormones. First, there's Cushing's syndrome, and this is due to chronic exposure to too much glucocorticoids. Typically, you see this in people who are taking corticosteroids for therapy for long periods of time. However, some cases can occur when the adrenal gland itself produces too much hormone. And in some cases, specifically in Cushing's disease, which is a specific type of Cushing's syndrome, the pituitary gland secretes too much ACTH, and then that subsequently results in too much cortisol being released by the adrenal glands. Symptoms include obesity, hypertension, osteoporosis, hirsutism, which is excessive hair growth. They can get hyperglycemic and develop type 2 diabetes, of course immunosuppression, as mentioned, and even kidney stones and menstrual irregularities. Next, there's Addison's disease, and this is a primary adrenal insufficiency. So what happens here is the adrenal glands fail. They have a lack of response to ACTH. And so the pituitary is just going to release more ACTH and more ACTH, but the adrenal glands cannot respond. What you get here is a chronic shortage of glucocorticoids and sometimes mineralocorticoids as well. Causes include damage to the adrenal glands from things like autoimmune destruction, infection, cancer, etc. Symptoms include weight loss, fatigue and weakness, hypotension, and skin darkening. And the reason that the skin darkens is kind of interesting. It all has to do with ACTH. Now, ACTH is made from a larger precursor molecule that gets broken into ACTH and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So, in the production of ACTH, a byproduct is you're producing melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And what that does is it stimulates the melanocytes in the skin to produce melanin, and so the skin darkens. Treatment here is going to be a replacement of those corticosteroids that the adrenal gland cannot make. The pancreas. The pancreas is located behind the stomach, okay, so posterior to the stomach, between the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, and the spleen. Now, the pancreas has endocrine functions, but it also has exocrine functions as well. The pancreas has these cells called acinar cells, and they generate the exocrine secretions that the pancreas releases for digestion. This is going to make up the vast majority of the pancreas. And then you've got these clusters of cells, of endocrine cells, in these pancreatic islets. And so you'll find a few types of cells in these clusters. There's alpha cells, which secrete glucagon. There are beta cells, which secrete insulin. And then there's delta cells and F cells. Delta cells secrete somatostatin, and the F cells secrete pancreatic polypeptide. Here you can see the pancreas. The head of the pancreas is nestled here in the duodenum, and then over here is the spleen. The stomach would lie kind of right here, anterior to the pancreas. Now, if you zoomed in, you would find these acini, okay, these ducts here, pancreatic acinus, and then you would see the pancreatic islets, which is this cluster of cells here. And those islets contain alpha cells and beta cells. What do the hormones of the pancreas do? Well, they help maintain blood glucose levels. A healthy range is somewhere between 70 to 110. High levels of blood glucose are going to damage blood vessels, and especially the blood vessels of the kidneys. And this is going to lead to, over a long period of time, kidney damage. Low levels of blood glucose is going to result in lethargy, and then mental and physical impairment, and ultimately, if low enough, your brain is going to starve, okay, and you'll die. Right, how is insulin release regulated? Well, after you eat, the beta cells are going to detect a rise in blood glucose levels, and they're going to secrete insulin in response to that. Insulin is then going to travel through the blood and encounter target cells and trigger those target cells to bring in glucose, so that the overall effect is going to be blood levels of glucose decreasing. Now, this is regulated by negative feedback. So when those blood glucose levels fall, the beta cells sense that and stop secreting insulin. What are the effects of insulin? Well, insulin decreases the blood level of all nutrients, so not just glucose, but also fatty acids and amino acids. Hepatocytes are going to remove glucose from the blood in response to insulin and store it as glycogen. So insulin stimulates glycogenesis. Adipose cells are going to decrease the fatty acid levels in blood and start storing fat. So lipogenesis is stimulated. All right, we said most body cells are going to increase nutrient uptake, in response to insulin. So this is going to result in an increase in amino acid uptake by cells and therefore protein synthesis by the cells. It's going to also increase glucose uptake by the cells, and it does this by incorporating more glucose transport proteins into the plasma membrane of the cell. Some cells do not require insulin to take in glucose, and this is going to include things like the neurons, the kidneys, hepatocytes or liver cells, as well as red blood cells. All right, let's talk a little bit about diabetes. What is diabetes? Well, it's going to be the inadequate uptake of glucose from the blood. And what you see is chronically elevated glucose levels. And this ultimately is going to result in blood vessels being damaged, especially small blood vessels. And so that's going to be a problem for structures that are supplied by small blood vessels, such as the retina and the kidneys. Because blood vessels are damaged, your tissues are not going to be able to heal as well either. So we see a lot of non-traumatic amputations in diabetic patients who have poorly healing ulcers on, say, their feet. Diabetes is associated with an increased heart disease risk and stroke risk. Okay, there's type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is going to be the basically the absence of the release of insulin by the pancreas. So the pancreas just cannot release insulin, can't produce insulin for whatever reason. And we think is probably an autoimmune in origin. You tend to see type 1 diabetes in children and adolescents and younger adults. And treatment here is going to be daily injections of insulin. You got to replace that insulin that your body, your pancreas, is not making. All right, then there's type 2 diabetes. And this is due to a decrease in insulin's effectiveness on its target cells. Now, this tends to occur in older adults, but it can occur in young people as well. Treatment here is going to be diet, exercise, and medication. And then there's gestational diabetes, and this you see in pregnant women. If gestational diabetes is not treated, it can cause risk to the fetus, as well as increase complications during delivery. All right, and then there's hypoglycemia. So this is where your blood glucose levels are too low, below 60. There's a lot of different causes here. So you can have insulin overdose, you can have prolonged exercise cause it, excessive alcohol use, liver or kidney dysfunction, even the tumors of the pancreas, such as an insulinoma. Symptoms are going to include hunger, dizziness, confusion, sweating, and sleepiness. Ultimately altered mental status, right? Because the brain is not getting enough glucose. And if you have a patient who is so hypoglycemic that they are unconscious, the treatment is glucagon. So what is glucagon? Well, glucagon is released by the alpha cells in the pancreatic islets. And those alpha cells detect a drop in blood glucose and then release glucagon in response to that. And glucagon goes and acts on target cells, causing them to release stored nutrients such as glucose into the blood. Glucagon release is going to be regulated by negative feedback. So as blood glucose levels rise, glucagon release is going to decrease. Okay, the effects of glucagon, we said cells are going to release their stored nutrients into the blood. So hepatocytes are going to release glucose, right? They're going to break down glycogen and release glucose from that. They can also build glucose from other molecules. Adipose cells are going to release fatty acids and glycerol, so lipolysis is going to be stimulated. Glucagon, as I said, can be given to unconscious patients who have a low blood sugar. All right, then there's the pineal gland. This is a small unpaired gland in the epithalamus of the diencephalon of the brain. So you might remember the diencephalon is composed of the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So what the pineal gland does is it secretes melatonin at night, and that's going to cause drowsiness. And that sleepiness at night and the wakefulness during the day is called our circadian rhythm. So melatonin helps regulate the circadian rhythm. It also has effects on mood. It also influences gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion. And then there are the parathyroid glands. These guys are small structures on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. The actual number of them varies, usually between 2 to 6. Often there's about 4 of them. They contain chief cells and oxyphil cells. So the chief or principal cells make parathyroid hormone. And what parathyroid hormone does is it increases blood calcium. This is going to be in response to low blood calcium. So parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcium from the bone. It decreases the loss of calcium in the urine, and it's going to activate calcitriol. The function of those oxyphil cells is still unknown. All right, and then we have several structures that have an endocrine function. So you have the thymus, and the thymus contains epithelial cells that secrete thymic hormones. And those thymic hormones are crucial for the development and maturation of T cells. Now, the thymus is located anterior to the heart. It grows during childhood, but after puberty it starts to shrink. And like I said, it's a maturation site for T cells. There's endocrine tissue in the heart, in the atria of the heart. That's those 2 top chambers of the heart. This tissue can secrete atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. ANP is going to lower blood pressure, and the way it does this is it increases the release of sodium in the urine, and water follows sodium. So you increase urine output, and it also helps the blood vessels to dilate. The kidney has endocrine cells that release the hormone erythropoietin. This is going to be secreted in response to low blood oxygen levels. And what erythropoietin does is it stimulates red blood cell production. All right, the liver, we already mentioned, secretes insulin-like growth factors in response to growth hormone. But it also secretes the inactive hormone angiotensinogen. Now, what happens with angiotensinogen is it becomes angiotensin II. It gets converted by a series of enzymes from the kidneys and the lungs. Angiotensin II ultimately works to raise blood pressure. It does this by constricting blood vessels, decreasing the loss of fluid in the urine, right? So decreasing urine output, and stimulating thirst. The stomach secretes a hormone called gastrin, and gastrin increases the secretion and the motility in the stomach to help aid in digestion. The small intestine is going to secrete a couple of hormones, in particular secretin and cholecystokinin. Secretin is going to stimulate the secretion of bile and pancreatic juice. Cholecystokinin stimulates the release of bile specifically from the gallbladder. The skin also has hormonal functions. So you may recall that the skin and skin cells Light converts modified cholesterol to vitamin D3, which then gets released into the blood. Vitamin D3 then gets converted to calcidiol in the liver, which is then converted to calcitriol in the kidneys. And remember, calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D, which is actually a hormone that raises blood calcium. Adipose tissue secretes leptin. Leptin is a hormone that acts to reduce appetite. It binds to neurons in the hypothalamus. Lower body fat is associated with less leptin, and so that's going to stimulate appetite. Adipose also has some other endocrine effects. It can raise the risk of cancer, can delay male puberty, and then abnormally low adipose interferes with the female menstrual cycle. Finally, what happens to the endocrine system as we age? Well, in general, things are just going to kind of decrease, okay? Secretory activity wanes. You get a reduced efficiency of the endocrine system's functions, and overall decreased levels of hormones.